Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at the basics of Entity Framework. We created our very own application DB context, where we defined our tables in which the rows are the specific types that we have also defined. And now we know that every single property that's not a complex object is a column in the database, and that Entity Framework is also automatically creating some properties or expects us to have some properties like the ID, which is the primary key, and the fruit ID, which would be the foreign key of the fruit inside the address, which is how it finds its relation. We also learned how to query the database, we found out about transactions, and how to, in the end, map from what we have in the database to what might be used on the UI. Now in today's episode, we're going to clean our projects up before we actually add unit tests for our AppDB context so we can see where things are and how they fit together. So let's close this file and we will drop down these two sandbox projects, and what we want to focus on is separating the production code of the voting system from the voting system.tests project. So let's start with the counter manager tests, and we're going to scroll down to the production code, which is the counter model and the counter manager. So we can Alt-Enter, basically click on the class, press Alt-Enter, and you will get a few options that you can use. And one of them will be move type to counter class. And yeah, you just press Enter, and that will show you where it's going to move it. And I guess the changes that will apply. So let's apply. Let's see where it is. And we're going to see the counter object here outside of the counter manager file. That is very nice. Let's go ahead and do the same with the counter manager. Okay, let's move it out. Boom. So there's our counter manager. What I'm going to do is, before going on to the next files, is I want to stick them in their own project. And this is part of the refactoring stages of test-driven development. So you're allowed to do this as long as your tests work in the end, okay? So let's right-click, and again, let's go ahead and add a new project. And because our solution is called voting system, and this one is called voting system.tests, we can call this something like voting system.core as core functionality, but then we'll need to rename the test project to voting system.core.tests to keep convention. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to name the project voting system, if of course it allows me. So I'm still going to create a console application, and actually no, I'm not going to create a console application because it doesn't need to be an application. It doesn't need to run. It just needs to be a collection of classes. So it's going to be a class library. So let's go ahead and select class library. I'm going to click next, and we're just going to name it voting system as just discussed. Let's go ahead and create that. Okay, so we got the project here. Let's go ahead and delete this class. Let's grab our counter and counter manager, and we'll drag. Let me select them again, and we'll drag them into the voting system. Now it will copy them. Not sure why I wanted them to move them. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete those two. Now what will happen in the counter manager test is all the tests will break because it no longer knows what counter and counter manager are, right? So they're no longer in this project. This project is not aware of other projects. So what we have to do is the same way, if we look in our CS_proj file, the same way we add references to other libraries like mockq and xunit. You might already know how to do this. You right click on the dependencies, you click add references, you go to the projects section, and then you select which one of the projects from your solution you want to add to your project that you're adding the dependencies to, right? So let's go ahead and select the voting system, and everything that's going to be inside the voting system is now going to also be added to the voting system.tests project, and we can include the namespace. Okay, let's press OK, and now we'll see our CS_proj file change, and it will now include a project reference. Please note that package reference to your Nugget packages will be package reference with the version. Project reference just includes the path on your local system. Okay, let's close that. Everything works. One thing that we also want to fix if we go to the counter is the namespace. So we're no longer in the test project, so what we want to do is remove this namespace here, and we want to do the same for the counter manager. Let's remove the test here. So once that's done, if we go back to the counter manager, everything will still work because voting system.tests is inside the voting system namespace. So this is kind of the root namespace, okay? And the kind of thing that we can do is, because counter is sort of our model, it's a data type, it's a data object, right? It has no functionality. It's meant to represent data, okay? And usually the convention for this is to have something like a models folder. And by the way, a lot of people ask me about this window here. If you want the same window, it's an extension called Add New File. I talk about it in my Visual Studio 2019 setup, so you can go watch that video if you're interested about other things that you can do with this. But this is how I create my files and folders. Okay, so let's create a models folder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the counter into the models. There we go. And what I will also do is I will add the namespace. So I want the namespace to match the folders. Okay, models, not models, models. And usually what you will do, if you will create a new file in this folder, it will give it the namespace on its own. So let's go into the counter manager tests. And now we're going to be missing the counter namespace. So if you think about it, voting system is the root, and we're sort of branching off into the test folder. And if we branch off in the other direction to the models folder, that's where our counter is. So that's when we want to Alt-Enter on this and import the using statement for the models. And another thing, what's breaking here is the counter manager, right? So the same thing is kind of happening here. This is only located in the parent, so in the root, at the top sort of level. And as we go down, what's at the top isn't aware at things that are at the bottom or deeper down. So counter, because we add on the models, it would be aware of the counter manager, but the counter manager isn't aware of the models. So this is something that we have to also import here. So let's go ahead and import this here. Okay, so that took a little bit, that took a while, but it's important to understand what namespaces are and where to essentially use them and how to structure your project. Okay, let's go ahead and do the same with our voting poll tests, because voting poll interactor, we're going to talk about it a bit here after we are done with our voting poll tests, right? So let's go ahead and extract our voting poll factory tests, or no, sorry, we want the actual production classes. If I stop jumping around, the iVoting poll factory, let's grab the interface. We will also grab the voting poll factory, and we'll grab the voting poll itself as well. Let's go ahead and select these three files. So iVoting poll factory, voting poll, and voting poll factory. And let's go ahead also move them into the voting system, just like that. And again, it seemed to copy it, so I probably could right click move it or something like that. And again, another thing, voting poll is a data object, and I'm going to state this again. Data object is just a way to represent data the way it is in memory, right? So we can actually access its classes, etc. And usually this sort of stuff goes into models as a separate thing because it contains no functionality. It's just data representation. So now if we take a look, voting poll and counter are in the same object in the same folder, but it's still confined counter, and that's because the namespace of voting system dot models isn't here. So because now voting poll is inside the models folder, we want to go ahead and give it the models namespace. And now we can find it. Nice. Let's go to iVoting poll factory. Make sure everything works here. Everything looks all right except the namespace. Let's go ahead and remove this. It actually was a little bit delayed here, but we want to import the voting poll. So let's using voting system dot models at the top here. And then this is still in the wrong namespace. So let's go to the voting poll factory and let's remove the tests because now it's in the root folder. Okay. And again, because it's in the root, we can't actually see the voting poll. We will need to bring in the namespace. All right. And again, this is missing the link library, so we actually need to import this here as well. Everything else seems to be working in these files, except... so I'm in the voting poll test files, and it's missing the voting poll, so let's go ahead and bring in using voting poll models. Okay, so let's go ahead and build and see where we're at now. One thing is still failing, and that's inside the voting poll interactor tests. Let's go ahead and take a look at this, and we're missing the voting poll, so let's go ahead and grab the using statement. Okay, let's build everything again, make sure it all builds, and if it builds, we can actually run our tests. Let me pin this window because we're actually going to be using this right now, and let's run them. Okay, so since all of our tests are passing, let's go ahead, close everything except the voting poll interactor tests, and let's talk a little bit about where to put our voting system persistence and voting poll interactor. Now, the voting poll interactor is dependent on the interface of the voting poll factory, so it's going to be using the voting system library. And then it also depends on the voting system persistence interface, which is meant to represent our database layer. So the interactor itself is separate from the voting system and the database, and it's meant to kind of bring the two things together under its wings, okay? So it's really a project in and of itself, and hopefully it will be a little bit apparent when we actually put it into the project. So let's go ahead and create it first. We're gonna go into add new project, and we are going to again get a class library. We're gonna go next, and we're gonna say voting system dot application. Okay, so bear with me if you're confused. Why is this application? This is not the application, all right? It kind of is, but it's not. We'll get to it, right? Let's just create it. So we have the voting system. We have the voting system dot application. This is way overblown for this small project. This is good enough to be in a one ASP.NET Core application. I know this. If you're sitting there and you're like, you're all killing with all this different project, different files, what are you doing? Calm down. We're here to learn about where stuff goes, okay? In a simple example. So bear with me. What is the application layer? This is meant to be the separation between the UI and the inner workings of your application. So your application, when it runs, it's going to execute your business rules, it's going to write to the database, it's going to send notifications, emails, it might interact with third-party software or APIs. The application layer is how the application is going to function all together. So let's say we have a WPF, Windows Press Forms application, right? So you are going to have a little window, you're going to press a button, and that's going to call a function in the application layer. And then, or even rather, you're gonna have a form where you're gonna fill out your voting, your voting poll, and when you click on the button, it's gonna invoke the create voting poll function, and it's gonna create a voting poll the way we define it in the voting system, and then it's gonna save it to the database. And then if we have users, it's going to send notifications as well to whoever following that user so they can vote on that poll, right? And that's just through WPF app. Let's say we're in the modern age, we have the internet the way it is right now. Nobody installs native applications. Everybody builds on the web, right? So we take it from the WPF application and we put it behind an ASP.NET Core application. So here, now somebody's going to fill out a form on the web page. He's going to press submit, he or she. It's going to go to the backend. It's going to go to your MVC controller. And all it's going to do is, again, just hit this create voting poll function. All you had to do is change the UI, okay? And then in the future, when Blazor comes out, when .NET 5 comes out, when all the native applications are going to be replaced by WebAssembly and C# will be able to compile to WebAssembly, all you will have to do is just replace the UI and your application inside will still work as is, okay? And that's the whole justification for having an application layer. So the application layer is the thing that brings everything together. So let's delete this useless class. Well, it wasn't too useless, it was a placeholder. Its sole purpose is to be deleted, okay? So I think it enjoyed that. Let's go ahead and extract the iVoting poll, or not iVoting system persistence. We're gonna move that to another file, and we're gonna move the voting poll interactor into its own file as well. And this is just a test. Let's go ahead and grab our voting poll interactor and our iVoting system persistence. I don't really like the name, but we can rename it later. Let's move it into the voting system application layer, and let's delete these two files. Let's go ahead and quickly fix the namespaces. So voting poll interactor. Let's go ahead and say application. Okay. We are going to be missing references to the iVoting poll factory because that is now in the voting system. So let's go ahead and add the dependency here. So we're going to add reference to the voting system. Again, remember that the voting system application has everything under its wings. Okay. And we're going to press OK. And we're going to have the iVoting poll factory. Let's go ahead and copy this application because now we can put it into this into the namespace of this iVoting system persistence. Okay, if you're struggling with the idea of the application layer, just to really seal the deal, right? If we take a look at the voting poll interactor, it might seem like the voting poll interactor is this thing that's standing over the voting poll factory, so over our voting system, and it's standing over our voting poll system persistence, which is going to be another project, and that's going to be the database. It feels like it's standing over, but really what voting system.application is a basket, and the voting poll factory and the voting poll system persistence are something that are put inside the basket through the constructor. Okay, so without carrying on for too long, let's go ahead and create a project for let's go ahead and clean up our tests a little bit further. So the voting poll interactor tests are now going to break because they don't have access to the iVoting system persistence and voting poll interactor. All right. I'm tired of saying these long names, so from now on, I'm going to refer to this and that until we get very specific. And this and that doesn't mean specifically this and that. It might be that and this, all right? So let's go ahead and create another project. And right-click, add new project. Okay, and here what we want to find is an XUnit test project. Let's go ahead and click next. For the project name, we're going to say voting system.application.test, and this is where we're going to put our application layer tests. Okay, let's go ahead and create this. Now, as we have this test project here, let's go ahead and get rid of the unit test class here, and what we will do is we'll grab the voting poll interactor tests. We're going to Control X this time to cut it and paste it there, so it will remove it from there and put it here. Now what we will actually do is we'll go into the voting system test CSproj. We'll take the mock Q library because we haven't been using it for the other tests. There's nothing to actually mock there. So we're going to take that library and we're going to put it into the voting system application tests project just over here. Okay, let's go ahead and close that. It's going to install the dependency. And now if we take a look at the tests, they're still going to be breaking all over the place, even more than before, because this project doesn't have it doesn't even have the reference to the voting system. So that's what we'll have to do. We'll have to add the dependency to voting system.application. Okay. What you don't want to happen is your test project referencing another test project. Okay. You can have libraries to help your test projects, but then they don't interact with your production code. So the test code should only really reference the project that it's meant to test, but then it already is going to inherit everything that project inherits. So if we look in the projects here, we're going to see that the voting system application, we get the voting system through that, right? So remember, the ideal situation is that one project test references the one application that it's going to be testing for. All right, so let's go ahead and make sure that I changed the namespaces here. I did. Let's grab the namespace, or actually let's grab the namespace here, but all I'm gonna do this is to grab the application and put it here, and then this namespace shouldn't be needed there anymore. Let's go ahead and build this and make sure that everything builds. Okay, everything's building. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, very nice. Now another thing that you will notice is in your project structure, what will happen is you will get this kind of sliced layers, right? So you will have your voting system, you'll have your test project, you will have your production code again, and then you will have your test code, and then somewhere in here you have your sandbox project. So what you tend to do is create a source folder. So we go to right click on solution, add, and create a new solution folder, and we call it source. Okay, and what we do is we grab the voting system and voting system.application, we take our production code and we put it in there. Okay, and for our test projects, we create another folder and we call it tests, and we grab our test projects and put it in the tests folder. And for these two projects, I usually don't have these sort of projects in the actual solution where I'm working on the production codes. These are usually the projects that are going to be just console applications that I quickly create on the site to play with, or I use LinkPad, which is a really awesome software to play around with C#. Okay, so now what we have is our production code in the source folder, our test in the tests folder, one test project for one production project, and a really decoupled solution. And we're going to talk a little bit about more coupling later on. But for now, I just want to set up the groundwork for our test project where we're going to develop the interaction with the database. So we're going to use TDD with Entity Framework, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about how the interactor plays into this a little bit later as well. So let's go ahead and close this. Let's go into tests. We're going to right click, add new project. We're going to again find the XUnit project. Where is it? There it is. Click next and loading system.database.tests. And again, creating this project is something like preemptive thinking. What we can do is start with the application tests project and create our entity framework test here. And then once we finally realize that we put our database behind an interface, and the interface is kind of like the connection between the two Lego pieces of the same size, right? So if another piece that fits it is kind of like adding a different database, we can just take out that piece and put another one on that in that place, okay? But it's a little bit more granular than that. We can replace half of it with Dapper or native SQL and keep half of it as entity framework, and we can replace stuff based on performance, okay? But that's going a little bit too far. I'm just going to preemptively think that we're going to have a database layer. That's what I want. Voting system.database.tests, okay? We don't have a voting system.database project just yet, but where you kind of, when you do test driven development, you understand you still know where you're kind of working. You're just writing code in a different way, okay? And this just makes you think a different way as well. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add voting system.application just so we have reference to the iVoting system persistence, because that's where the interface is, right? So this is our database. This is what we have to implement. All right. So let's go ahead, add reference to voting system.application. Let's click OK. We're going to delete this, and let's quickly just create a file. We'll add new. What am I doing? Let's create a new file, and we'll say database tests.cs. And here is where we're gonna write our tests. But I'm gonna cut the video here to kind of preserve the theme of the video. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this episode. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, leave a nice comment. If you have any questions, also leave a comment. Don't forget to join the Discord server. And as always, I'll see you in the next episode.